Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yurachek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Karandeep Singh Badwal, and he is the host of the MedTech Podcast, where he talks about the MedTech industry and its future. I was actually featured on this, and it was a very fun time. And basically, his background is a quality and regulatory consultant in the MedTech industry. And as we were just talking before the recording, this is a pretty new thing to be doing the consulting on his own. And so they had started this relatively recently, and before he was working for some other companies. So pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to introduce yourself better than I just did?
Yep, sure. So I'm Karandeep Singh Badwal, and I'm a quality and regulatory consultant specializing within the medical devices space, and also run the MedTech Podcast. As you mentioned, you as a guest, and we were talking about neural implants. In terms of what I actually do, people ask, what is quality and regulatory? It's about ensuring the safety and the performance of a medical device and ensuring that everything is legal with that device when it hits the market effectively, which anybody who works in the legal framework will tell you it's a complete minefield. So it's very important that you hire somebody who knows that inside out to ensure that your product hits the market as safely and as quickly as possible.
So basically making sure that as you're making the device, no uranium or lead gets into it and poisons somebody. Is that essentially it? So basically, is that something that's, as something's already been like FDA approved and on the market being sold, this is like a continuous process, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So when it comes to quality and regulatory, we have something called post-market surveillance, which is that your product is out on the market, or in some cases in clinical trials. So your product doesn't necessarily have approval, but it's going through the clinical stages. It's still important that we monitor how that device is, because like with anything, even with medication, there may not be immediate side effects. It may take years or even decades. And that's very important that we monitor that.
Okay. So what does the work look like? What do you exactly do day to day? And what kind of companies do you work with?
Okay, so since I went into full-time consulting, as you may have already seen, there's a sudden boom in software and artificial intelligence devices. So previously I was working with traditional devices, pacemakers, defibrillators, wound dressings, etc. Now I'm working towards more digital-based devices. There's a lot of boom in that. And people often ask, why is that boom there? It's because that there's a lot of government funding. So as you would be aware, within the UK, our healthcare system is free. So if somebody creates a software or a device out there that can save either time or money, that's something that the government's heavily going to invest in. Also, artificial intelligence is really popular online. There seems to be a lot of investors going on there. It seems to be the next best thing. And there's a lot of movies out there talking about things like artificial intelligence. So it's something that people are interested in. In terms of what I actually do day to day, it's mainly documentation. So things like risk management, intended use statements. What is your product? What is it going to solve? What are the demographic? What are the use environments? Is it something that somebody's going to be using at home? Is it something that somebody's going to be using in a hospital environment? Is it going to be using themselves? Is it going to be under the supervision of a doctor? We also build things called quality management systems, which is basically things like documentation, records, like I mentioned, risk management as well, design controls. If you are updating your product, what controls do you have in place? Also reporting as well if something goes wrong. CAPAs, corrective action, preventive action. So you're constantly monitoring your process. And of course, there's a technical documentation as well, which is basically the blueprint of your product and how it works. And that's something that you submit to the regulatory authorities, basically for them to inspect, to make sure that this device is safe and is performing as per its intended use.
Yeah, very interesting. It sounds like a lot of paperwork, but rightly so, because people's lives are at stake. So I guess how does this relate to neural implants, brain-computer interfaces? What is overlap there, and what do you see that is important in this field?
The overlap there is effectively, when it comes to brain implants, a lot of them will be considered medical devices. And particularly when you're talking about the brain, they're going to be class 3. And when I talk class 3, that's the highest risk classification. You need clinical data to support that, etc. But when it comes to neural implants, these are not something that's been around for years on end. And particularly when it comes to the regulatory pathway for the USA. So the USA have a process known as the 510K and another one known as the de novo. The 510K process, it means that there's a predicate device out there. So if you've got a traditional device like a wound dressing or a pacemaker, there's hundreds of predicate devices out there, and that pathway is shorter. When we talk about things like neural implants, often there's not a predicate device, and we have to go through a process called de novo, which involves a lot more work because there's nothing else to compare it to on the market, and that can cause problems.
Okay. Yeah, this is a very good explanation. I've talked to a lot of people in this field, and so I've picked up all these terms and everything like this, but I think this is probably the best, most succinct description that I've heard so far. So I've really enjoyed this. Okay, so as they're going through this, they have to have the 510K, the de novo, and basically prove that the benefits outweigh the risks. And so how do they do that? What is the process for this? And I guess, how are you involved in that as well?
So effectively, what you do is you do something called a risk assessment, which is a process like you've touched on, the benefits and the risks, where you sit down and you determine that if this device is used as per its intended use, what are the modes of failure? So for example, like a brain implant, if it's an active product, can it cause things like electric shock? So then you're going to be doing things like biocompatibility. And if it's like a software-based product, you're going to be looking at things like false positives and false negatives. So for example, if it's telling you that you have a certain disorder, but you don't actually, you are then going to go and seek medical attention for that, which you don't actually need, which can potentially bring more harm to you. So it's all part of the risk assessment process. But the key thing that really comes down here, and I've always said this to every single client that I work with, is something known as an intended use statement. And what I mean by an intended use statement effectively is, what is the use environment for your product? Who is going to be using it? Is it going to be used by the lay user? Is it going to be used by the doctor? And what is going to be the intelligence level of these people? Are you dealing with elderly people who maybe are not educated? Is this product going to be used by a doctor who's got 20 years experience in radiology? Therefore, you're going to be using more complex language. That's what it really comes down to. So once you understand your product, who's going to be using it, you can then build a risk assessment around that. But if you do not know what your product is and you do not know the modes of failure, you really are going to struggle with this process.
Interesting. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And then I guess I want to talk about this software-based approach as well, and then versus a physical device and what the differences are. In neural implants, there are a lot of software-based things. You have to do spike sorting, spike recordings, and it's just frankly way too much data for any human to really be able to process. And so you have to be able to have some kind of software to be able to transform this data into something that's usable and manageable. So how does that work? And then how does that plug in, or how's that similar or different compared to devices?
So if we break it down, there's physical devices and there's software devices. But there's something that I find quite interesting, because a lot of companies out there think that they're a software only when they're actually not. Because often I ask them, they say, okay, great, you've got a software. Where is the data coming from? Oh, we have a data collection tool. That's a physical element and it's part of the device. And a lot of companies are not realizing that. Now that you've got something like a physical element, you have to do things like biocompatibility. If it's got an active one, you have to follow the 60601 standards, which is electrical safety. There's various different rules and things like that. They have to go through electric shock, etc. So that's what it really comes down to, is distinguishing between the two. Of course, is the modes of failure with the software. If the algorithm is incorrect, it's going to be given incorrect results. If it's like a physical product, like a pacemaker, the modes of failure are more obvious. With the software, it's more hypothetical on how it could potentially go wrong, really. So it's distinguishing between the two. And when it comes to something like a neural implant, it really comes down to is what purpose is that software doing? So for example, if you've got a physical implant, that software may just be, again, the equivalent of a data collection tool. So it's really distinguishing what is the software actually doing. And there are even in some cases whereby certain software, depending on the claims that you make and what it does, for example, like fitness trackers, they're not classed as medical devices, they're classed as wellness software. And even I've found with some clients is they often have two variants. So they'll create a sort of soft version of their device, which is a software as a medical device, with some of the claims turned off or some of the features turned off. They'll test it out on the market, see what the feedback is like, and then regulate it as a medical device with their intended use and claims.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty clever to see if that works. Okay, so let's say you have a really cool technology, you may be working in a lab at a university or something like this, you want to spin this technology out. What would be some next steps that you would see as you're trying to get FDA approval?
So effectively, I know I keep talking about the intended use statement. That's basically where you start. What conditions or diseases are you going to be screening? Are you going to be monitoring? Are you going to be treating? Are you going to be diagnosing? Are you going to be preventing? Because then that would determine what risk classification of devices. Who are you targeting? Is it certain genders? Are there age groups, certain races, or certain demographics? What are the health of those people? Do they have any existing conditions? Who are the intended user groups? Will this be done by a doctor? Will this be something that somebody does at home? Again, that's something you need to look into. What are the intended parts of the body? So like you've said, neural implants, so you're going to be targeting the brain or the head. Intended environment, is this a sterile device? Most likely, if it's going to be implanted. Is it single use? Is it reusable? A hospital use or home use? Is it ambulance use? Is it going to be basically the operating principle? And of course, what you want to look at is the foreseeable misuse. How can this device be misused? An example that I can give you is that you create a device that's supposed to be used by the supervision of a doctor, but then the patient is actually monitoring themselves, which you shouldn't be doing. And then you will start looking into ways to, mitigate that risk, i.e., having log-on information, having password information effectively to stop the patient going in and essentially fiddling with those files. So that's basically what you need to look into. Number two is the health economics of it too. Which market is your product going to have the most impact in? Because I often have a lot of clients that say to me, Karandeep, should we go for FDA because it seems easier than go to EU? I say, stop there for a moment. Where is the demographic that you're targeting? And where is your product going to have the most impact? So that's the first thing that you need to be looking at. Which areas of the world are you going to be targeting? And is it economically viable for you? And is it going to have an impact? Because if you make some crazy software out there that can only work on a really powerful computer, how many people around the world have computers like that? Even here in the UK, the NHS, if you ever come to a hospital in the UK, you would often see that a lot of the computer equipment is often 10 years older than the computer equipment you have at home. So again, it really comes down to is where can that product have the most impact?
Yeah, definitely. And then as listeners may hear, you're not based in the US, you are based in the UK, and your specialty is not necessarily the US, it's more EU and UK. So how are things different there versus the US, and what should people expect?
So what's happened is, as of the 26th of May in 2021, they came up with something called the EU Medical Device Regulation. So the previous Medical Device Directive was decades old. And the only mentioning of a software on that was maybe something like a computer that just operated it on and off. Software was never really thought of as a separate device or anything like that. What's happened now is because as the UK has gone through Brexit occurred before this new regulation came in place. So the UK has stuck to the old regulation, whereas the EU has now moved on. Now, the EU MDR had something called Rule 11, which had a big impact on software as a medical device and AI or anything software related. So previously, software was treated as a class 1 device. So that was self-certified, low risk, no notified body, no audit. You just register onto the government MHRA website and boop, your product's out on the market. No one's inspecting your technical file. Did that mean that there were products out on the market with no testing or anything in place? Possibly, because nobody's auditing them. Under the EU MDR Rule 11, a lot of these devices now became Class 2A, which meant that you had to get them externally audited. So that's the difference with what's happened. So the UK is relatively easy for software devices. The EU has now become more difficult. And in many cases, what's now happened is not just software, generally devices. Whereas previously the EU was considered to be easier than the US FDA, companies are now considering the US FDA first, as they're finding that regulatory pathway easier. And especially in the case of, like I mentioned, if there's predicate devices already on the US market, it makes that process a lot easier.
Okay. Yeah. So this is something that I've heard a lot is FDA used to be the really difficult one. People would start off in the EU, but now it sounds like there's a middle ground between the EU and the US that basically UK might be in between and maybe test the waters before going into the EU market. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. And I think the US reimbursement system often favors it from an economical point of view. As a lot of PIC clients have said to me that they prefer the US system rather than the UK.
Okay. Very cool. What were you doing before you started the consulting? Has it always been this quality regulatory side of things? And then I guess, how did you get into it as well?
So my background was actually in pharmaceutical science. That's what I studied at university. And I did a master's in pharmaceutical quality. I have not worked a single day in the pharma industry. So it was one of those ones, really. I came out of university and like with any student, you've got a ton of debt over your head. And you kind of just take the first job that you're given. Beggars can't be choosers in that situation. And it just happened to be a medical devices third-party manufacturer. So basically is that they manufacture for other medical device companies out there. And that's where I learned about medical devices. I heard about them in the past, but I did decide at university that I wanted to get into quality and regulatory. But it's when I worked in medical devices, I was shocked to hear that, whoa, you can get a product out in the market in 3 to 4 months, 6 months. I never heard of that. When it comes to pharmaceutical, we're talking years, even sometimes decades there. And the kind of claims that medical devices was making, you wouldn't dare try that in pharma. There's certain claims that you can make about medical devices. And it was just, that was the flexibility. And then I started to learn about medical devices. They're everywhere. Contact lenses, glasses, hospital beds, pacemakers, brain implants, they're all medical devices and the diversity of it. And I just fell in love with the industry and it just trickled on from there. And I just went through. Got to the point in my career where I got to top managerial roles, and I decided that I wanted to work with the diversity of products, because when you work with one company, you're only working with their product portfolio. Whereas with a consultant, I can pick and choose. So one day I'm working with a combination drug device, wound dressing. The other day I'm working with an AI software as a medical device. The other day I'm working with a pacemaker. And it's just really interesting to basically be able to work with all these different products. With pharma, you don't have that flexibility. So that's why I stuck with medical devices.
Yeah, that is interesting. And this is something that's attractive for me too, is basically I was going to say activation energy, or I don't know, the barriers to entry or that you have to cross in order to have a successful medical device company or medical device versus pharma is much bigger. Than theoretically it could be much more impactful as well. I have quite a negative view of the pharmaceutical industry, basically flooding your body with God knows what kind of drugs for years and years, and you don't really know what effects that has. I definitely agree that it seems easier, I think. Okay, so what is a common mistake that you see being made? If you can teach our audience and be sure that they're going to take a lesson to heart, what one thing would you change? And what one thing would you teach them to prevent this biggest mistake that you see happening?
Build quality and regulatory at the start of your idea, because what's happening is people are going out there and they're building these medical devices, they're getting it to work and then seeking the quality and the regulatory approval, where it should be built in from the start. Because what often happens is they build this device and then realize that they will not be able to make the claims that they think that they can make when it comes to that device. Had they spoken to somebody like me early on, before they spent all that time and money into R&D, I could have guided them in a different direction. So start with quality and regulatory in mind, because you can make the best device in the world, but if you can't get regulatory approval, it's never going on the market. Interesting.
So it's basically even a question of what's marketable or what's reimbursable or approvable, or versus just making a cool device just for the sake of the cool device, something like that.
Yeah, completely agree. And again, some people are making some very great devices out there. However, like I said, if it's really complex and people don't have the infrastructure to use it, how are you going to market it?
Yeah, definitely. This is definitely like an engineer thinking, and this is something that I'm guilty of as well, is like, I have this cool thing, what can I use it for? And actually you should really be looking at it the opposite way. Like, I have this really bad, problem, and I need to fix it. What tools can I use to be able to fix it? Which is kind of the opposite of what most people do. Yeah, let's talk about the podcast, the MedTech Podcast. It's a pretty new podcast. What do you talk about in the show? And then how did you end up starting it?
The journey I started doing video content in 2018, and that was going onto other people's podcasts and other people's platform, because the common question that I would get, especially on LinkedIn, was a lot of people who basically go into quality and regulatory, people often who fell into it. Maybe they worked as engineers for 10 years and they stumbled upon regulation and they fell into it. I was one of the few, and it's becoming commonplace now, that went straight into quality and regulatory. So often I would have students asking me questions like, how do I get a job in this sector? And there was a guy called Munir Al-Aziz. He's quite famous in the medical device industry. He runs a YouTube channel called Easy Medical Device. Me and him used to talk back and forth, and I mentioned to him, I said, I get a lot of students asking me this question. He said, well, why don't you come on my channel and do a video about it? Why not talk about how you got into quality and regulatory? And that was it. And I kept in touch with Munir, and I made videos with him, and I got invited to other people's podcasts. But everyone said the same thing to me. Look, you have your own unique style. You have your own way that you speak. Why not go and open your own podcast? And I just pondered on it for a while. And then one day I decided to just get up and bite the bullet, and I haven't turned back since. And the podcast itself is, I basically just interview people in the medtech, health tech space. And the podcast is quite open and relaxed. I've had founders on there. I've had people who work in search or recruitment. I've had people who are just at the start of their journey. And it's just really just the case, like with your podcast, is just bringing interesting people on and listening to the story and getting them to share their wisdom with the listeners.
Yeah, very cool. I also highly recommend doing some kind of podcast or reaching out, sharing your wisdom, and providing a platform for people to come on and share their wisdom as well, because it's changed my life, and it's very rewarding and re-energizes you. What have been some of the benefits that you've seen from your channel?
My network has grown massively since starting it, because I'm interviewing people on the other side of the world. Like, you're sitting here in the US. Go back a few years before digital platforms were commonplace, I probably would have had to catch a plane, and the chances of something like this happening would probably not have happened. Number two is the knowledge, because I'm bringing experts. What would take me hours and hours of internet search, I've got an expert in front of me that can break down that complex topic and teach it to me in 5 minutes. So it's another way of knowing what's going on in the industry. Number 3, it's a break from work. That's one thing. I really enjoy doing it. I really enjoy speaking with people, and it's just nice to get away from the day job and do something like this. Number 4, it's a real confidence builder. Once you get into that stride of having to contact people and the soft skills that you build communication skills. You learn how to schedule things. You learn how to basically question people. And number 5 is you learn how to think on your feet. Like you're talking to me right now. You have to come up with questions in split seconds. And I just find it sharpens your mind so much more having a podcast.
Yeah, I think so too. And it really, like you said, sharpens, especially with the questioning. And it's because I'm not a quality expert or quality and regulatory expert, but just based on what you've been saying, it's very good. So I've really enjoyed this. This has been enlightening. And hopefully the listeners have taken away some bits of wisdom from this. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, why not? Let's talk about your travels. As you run the Travel Wisdom podcast as well, I'm aware that you've been to hundreds of countries. What advice would you have to people who want to get into travel? Where do you start?
Yeah. So this isn't something I've talked about a lot on the show. I have another podcast, the Travel Wisdom Podcast, which was on ice. It was in hibernation mode up until last week, I think, or this week. So it really is going to be bringing that back on board. And yeah, you're right. I've visited over like 100 countries or something like this. I've spent many years abroad, and I've really liked it. COVID did change that. And even settling down to do a PhD here at University of Florida, that's changed things. But yeah, basically, especially now with like remote work and such easy communication platforms, WhatsApp, video conferencing, video calls, it's so much easier than it used to be. And the hardest part is really just to pull up and go do it, just to go buy that flight somewhere and then figure it out as you go. So that's maybe the podcast or the thinking on your feet, the talking right there. But I think anybody can do it. And it's really not that hard, especially nowadays. It's just so easy. You're not going to get lost. Yeah. How about you? What's your experience with this?
My experience, I do need to start traveling more. So as I started the podcast and things like that, I'm building a network around the world. And my plan is to go to more MedTech conferences, travel the world, get to know people. And like previously, when we were talking, you even said to me straight away that I'm in a fortunate position where I can just pick up a laptop. That's all I need to do my work. So why not go on holiday somewhere in East Asia for a couple of weeks, work there? As long as I've got an internet connection, I can enjoy a different country and continue working.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, do you want to talk about the time zone shift difference that you were talking about? So a lot of your clients are in the UK and Europe, but yeah, so do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I do actually have some US clients, and particularly a lot of them on the West Coast. MedTech is really popular from California due to Silicon Valley and various other reasons, funding, etc. But yeah, it's quite strange. For example, like when I'm packing up for the day and it's 6 p.m. and my work starting, I'm talking to clients in California, and these guys are just barely getting out of bed and sipping on their coffee. And it's quite interesting when you work like that. And again, if I am going to travel effectively, and I've got most of my clients in the UK and the EU, I go to somewhere like California, I would have to be up at 3 to 4 a.m. in the morning just to keep up with them. So yeah, time zones is quite interesting, but clients I find are quite wary of this, and especially that we're in a digital world, people are quite respectful. I've got another client of mine who lives in Singapore, but he starts his day at midnight due to him working UK hours. So it is a factor to consider. Yeah, definitely. And then unfortunately, those people in Singapore and Australia and everything like this, they have the harder time zone change. So I think it is much more difficult, but it's a reality. So I guess in your case, the basically the Asia, the India, China, Southeast Asia might be something better because it is, you could maybe start your day at noon and go till, I don't know, 9 p.m. or something like this, which is, to me, that's the more pleasant way to work and live. Yeah, but it's a new reality, and I think things are going to be changing, and maybe even the 9 to 5 workday is going to change and just dissolve into 24 hours a little bit. So we'll see. Yeah, the world's opening up, and it seems like over the next couple of months, the pandemic's going to be easing off. So I can imagine travel is going to get really busy. Yeah. Knock on wood. Karandeep, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on. No, thank you very much.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.